So, without planning, I purchased another project car, aka Vanilla Ice. It's a 1991 Mercedes SL500 r129. And much like the rapper from the 90s, this was one of the hottest things going on. And of course, it's also white. And much like the rapper, this car has obviously seen much better days. But I know we can fully restore this icon and get it running like it used to. So join me while we take Vanilla Ice and make a comeback. So one day we can once again be rolling with our rag top down. What do you guys think? Let's do it. So let's get started by popping the hood and giving this engine bay a nice clean down. From the looks of it, it's been a few years since anyone's cleaned out this engine bay, and there's a lot of leaves, debris, and other things that we need to get out of here before we can diagnose the engine. And I am a big fan of starting with a clean slate and a nice clean engine bay when trying to work on a car. You can see here there's just tons of leaves caught up in each little area, and it's kind of making it difficult to even diagnose some of these electrical components. So I realized a lot of the junk I was seeing in the engine bay was caused by this trunk lining just disintegrating over time. I mean, we're in Florida and the heat is so brutal out here, this is just going to happen. So let's take care of it now so we don't have to deal with it in the future. So after removing most of the debris from the engine bay, I moved on to degreasing down the components. I wanted to be very careful here and cautious of hitting any electrical components and also covering up my throttle body. I also only used a hand pump sprayer to wash it down after degreasing it by hand. Now this will not be the final detail I do on this engine bay, but I still wanted to get rid of most of the dirt, grime, and grease that had built up over the years. This way it gives me a much better area to work on. Also, I have to give Super Clean a huge shout out for not only being one of my first sponsors, but for always supporting this channel and sending me out product to help with these projects. After finishing up the engine bay, I moved on to cleaning out the airbox. You never know what you're going to find in these. Fortunately for me, this wasn't that bad, so I just cleaned it down, and we're going to put this off to the side while we diagnose the engine. And it feels good to have a nice clean engine bay to work on. I hope you guys really enjoyed that little segment. Now it's time to move on to diagnosing the engine. So let's start by examining the engine bay and finding any broken parts so we can swap them out with our parts car. Oh, I forgot to mention we have a parts car. It's our 91 wide body project car. We're going to be doing an engine swap in that, so we won't be needing any of the engine parts, but they're all the same, so we can swap them over, test them out, and make sure it runs good. Great thing is the wide body car runs pretty good, so we know all the parts are working. So let's get started. So of course we're going to find some parts we didn't realize were broken. This happens to be the camshaft sensor. Fortunately, we just swapped that out for a brand new one on our parts car. So let's go ahead and switch that over. Now this happens to be a perfect example of a Florida car. As you can see here, all the pieces seem to be dried out and brittle. So let's go ahead and remove everything out of this, swap it out for the new part, and finally back in business. So to update everyone, currently the ASR light is on and we're getting a very long start. Once it starts, we are getting a very bad idle. But let's go ahead and try to start it again after swapping these parts. So it does seem to want to start a little bit easier, but obviously we still have an issue. So let's go ahead and test some of the electrical components and see what we can come up with. So I pulled out my free Harbor Freight ohm reader, hooked it up to the ICV idle control valve on vanilla ice, and to my surprise there was 0 volts going to the idle control valve. I guess this could be an issue. So let's go ahead and see what we get if we hook it up to our parts car. So moving over to the parts car, I went ahead and put the key in the accessory position, hooked up our ohm reader, and we have 0.35 volts. Now I went ahead and got in the car and turned it all the way to the start position, and you will see the volts go up. Now I'm going to attempt to crank. So guys, having this car to test some things out is priceless. I had no clue that volts would continue to go through our idle control valve plug right here, even with no key in the ignition and not cranking. I thought it might even need to be started before we'd get any volts. As you can see here, it's holding about 0.34, 0.35 volts. This will eventually have 0 volts. Now what I was able to do on this car was follow our wiring here so I could see exactly where it goes, and it comes into this wire loom here, which comes down to this unit here. Now if I pull that, you'll see we have 0 volts obviously. What I'm realizing is if you don't get that plug to go in perfectly, you won't get any volts to come through there, and the car itself, as you guys heard there, almost cranked over, but it will not crank over. You crank and crank and crank and crank and crank. So now I'm starting to wonder, this gives us a great way to diagnose if our plug is just not plugged in properly over on the white car, if somebody took it off. The unit, which I think is probably the idle control unit down here, and we'll figure that out, but the unit itself could be bad. The wiring could be bad. There could be a break in the wiring somewhere, or something else, I don't know, corrosion on the wire. So what we need to do is get over there. We can test continuity, we can test the plug itself. If the plug is not properly seated, we can try to reseat that, and obviously we can check for corrosion. So let's jump back over to the white car. I'm really excited. We can start diagnosing. This could be our biggest part of our start. Well, it's really giving us a very long start, and it's also giving us a crazy idle. That could be a big reason why. So let's jump over there and start diagnosing. So I went ahead and pulled the plug on vanilla ice, and I was really hoping that something would stand out like corrosion or a loose wire, but nothing looked out of place. So I grabbed the ohm reader and wanted to test the female end of this plug with the ignition on. And you can see here, we were definitely getting power to the plug. So now it's kind of back to the drawing board. Why are we not getting power to our idle control valve? At this point, I went back and forth with my good friend Vito on a ton of messages, and we decided that we needed to download the proper schematics so we can find out exactly where the idle control valve plug leads to. And we both agreed that running an old school scan through the diagnostic port could give us the codes to better understand what is going on. Yeah, I know. I should be focusing on the electrical system at hand, but I still have to wait till we can download the schematics. And off camera, I went to start the car again and it wouldn't start. Now I do have to let you know the gas gauge does not work, so I decided let's start with adding fuel to the system, and why not add all of these additives. So let's go ahead and see if we can get it to fire up again. So, technically, I could bore you with about 15 more minutes of this, me cranking the engine, spraying starter fluid in, and never getting it to fully start and idle, but I'm not going to do that. What I need to do is figure out what is causing this, because it was starting before. It wasn't starting great, but it did start and it did idle, and it idled crazy. Now, nothing. So we need to kind of look at what is causing this. So let's tear into this fuel system. So after a little research, I realized there's a special tool needed to test the proper fuel pressure on this system. But we can go ahead and crack open the incoming fuel line to see what type of pressure we have, if any. This will let us know if the fuel pumps are working, maybe a fuel filter is clogged. I don't know, but let's go ahead and crack it open and see. So while I was cracking open these lines, I realized I was opening up the outcoming line. But you can see here, we can still see there's fuel pressure. I guess that's good, but I decided to try to open up the incoming line and see what kind of fuel pressure we would get. And that's when I realized I messed up. Because I wasn't taking my time, I accidentally spun the fuel line. But we have a parts car, so let's go ahead and take the parts off of that one. As you can see here, I'm actually taking off the inline fuel filter that I didn't realize existed. So let's clean this thing down, and then we can go ahead and add it right back to vanilla ice. I also want to go ahead and crack open our fuel injection lines to see if we're getting any pressure to them. I really don't know. I'm kind of confused why we're not getting much pressure. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I had a few sleepless nights and spent a lot of time on some forums, and everything kept leading me back to swapping out the ECM. Now, this was one of the first things that Vito came up with, and for some reason, we never went back to it. Maybe it was because I was afraid of stripping these screws out, I don't know, but I am glad I decided to look into it again. As you guys can see here, it wasn't that difficult to swap out. Well, for the first time, we have bolts going to our idle control valve, and it started up and started to idle. I'm not sure exactly why, but this is absolutely great news. Well guys, this is incredible. It's been started now for about 10 minutes. It's got a really nice idle to it. I am just blown away. And biggest thing is we have power to our idle control valve finally. And it all was the ECM. I had no clue. Now, I'm gonna tell you, Vito originally told me to swap this unit out, and I was trying to take it out, and I was afraid of stripping the screws that held it in, so I put that off, and we never got the schematics downloaded for the wiring. I was looking at the wiring and said, I don't think that leads back into there, so we kind of crossed that out, and I wish we didn't. I got on some forums, and another person told me, change your ECM out. I just did that, and obviously that was one of our biggest issues. Now, back to what else is still wrong with this. Our ASR light is still on, and what I had done that I did not record
was go ahead and take out the rod gears because I could not get the car to stay started. What was happening is every time I gave it throttle, this would stay wide open, get stuck, and then you couldn't even restart the car. It would just crank and crank and crank, and if I manually push this back down, I could get it to start. Now, I don't know if any of that got fixed by changing out our ECM, but I have a feeling there's something else we need to swap out to fix that ASR issue. Once again, we have the parts car, so that's good. Oh, there goes something with the idle. And then unfortunately, while playing around with pulling throttle, somehow this got stuck on something, probably up in here, and I snapped that. So we've got to change out our throttle cable, and we've got to play around with some other things, but that'll be on the next episode. Guys, this is a great way to end this video. I am very excited. The car goes forward and backwards. I've already put it into gears. It's great. This thing is going to be running very soon, so stay tuned for the next episode. We're going to work deep into this, get this car running really good, and then we'll dive into interior and exterior. So let's go, guys.